Welcome to Madlik. My name is Jeffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Toldot. Last year, when we discussed the creation of the tabernacle, we explored a powerful theological concept called Tzimzum, where God creates the world by contracting his presence. This year, we continue the discussion with a historical, ideological, and political perspective. We explore how, after the expulsion from Spain, this concept profoundly impacted every aspect of the Jewish journey into modernity and up until the current political situation in Israel. So join us when God Gets Small continued. So welcome. Every week I have to make sure that I'm not talking about the same thing that I talked about in past years. So I wanted to talk about Tzimzum. I love Tzimzum. And I went back to last year's podcast, and lo and behold, we talked about Tzimzum. And I listened to it, and I encourage any of you who haven't listened to it recently to go ahead, because this is a continuation of that discussion. We are going to get into what Tzimzum is. As I said before in the introduction, it's when God creates the world by contracting. And I think that at the end of last year's podcast, to give you a sense of the direction we took last year, we asked the question of how is it possible that God, on the one hand, can contract himself and withdraw from the world, but also be mitzamtzem, make himself small and come into the temple. And I quoted, if you remember, Rabbi Shai Held, who said it's kind of like a relationship. Sometimes you have to give the other person space by contracting yourself and moving away. And other times you have to get into their life and be a part of every aspect of it. And so that gives you a sense that last year we were really talking on a very personal level, a theological level. But this year we're going in a whole other direction. We're going to really look at history, and in a sense, it's almost going to be a master class in Gershon Sholem, the great historian, scholar of Kabbalah, and we're going to use him as a guide, and I think we're going to be kind of surprised by some of the ramifications that Tzimzum had throughout history. So, Rabbi, do you share even a little bit my fascination with Tzimzum?
It's a really, really good topic. And I wasn't sure, I wasn't sure what angle you were going to take in terms of Tzimzum.
So what we're starting with is the Parsha deals with the Israelites building God a temple. And there's one verse in Exodus 25:8. And it says, "And let them make me a sanctuary that I may dwell among them." And the key word that we discussed really ad nauseum last year was v'shechanti b'tocham, and I will dwell. And if you hear the word Shekhinah in V'shechanti, you are on the money. I will dwell within them. And the whole question is, what does within them mean? And we quoted one piece of Midrash in Shemot Rabbah, where it has a conversation where the moment when the Holy One said to Moses, "Make me a tabernacle," Moses was dumbfounded and said, "The glory of the Holy One fills the upper worlds and the lower," and he said to make him a tabernacle. And he said before the Holy One, "But will God indeed dwell on the earth?" So really, there is this question here of how the infinite can become part of our world of finitude. And at the end it says, "The Holy One replied to Moshe, I do not see things the same as you do. I will come down and contract my presence within a space of 1 cubit by 1 cubit." And it says in the Hebrew, "Va'atzamtzem shechinati b'toch ama al ama." So this word that the Kabbalists went to town with is used very very rarely, and this is one of the rare occasions that it is used in a rabbinic midrashic text. And the earliest understanding of Tzimzum, which means really to contract, is that God took his infinite presence and brought it inside of the tabernacle. And what we are going to discuss today is how the Kabbalists in Safed in Israel, took this concept and made it into something that I am going to argue with the help of Gershon Sholem today, affected every aspect of Jewish life, affected the thoughts that everybody in listening to this podcast probably has about Judaism, affected history, ideology, theology, and even nationalism. So the first thing that Sholem does is he explains what this meant from a theological perspective and then how it evolved. And he said that ultimately this concept of God creating the world, instead of emanating into the world by slowly but surely materializing himself through these different sphirot, which I described last year as a sense of almost kicking the can down the road. Instead, he contracted himself. He says the doctrines developed in the schools of Safed apparently embodied some fundamental and universal Jewish quality that's transcended all local variations. And he says what they did was they had recently been exiled from Spain. And you have to understand, Spain in its day was like American Jewry. It was like right before Europe and the Holocaust. It was Jews were in every facet of life. And they thought they had arrived, and all of a sudden a catastrophe occurred, and they lost everything. And the Kabbalists went to Safed, and for the first generation, they really felt that this cataclysmic event had occurred and the Messiah would come. And when that wore off, they had to figure out what everything meant. And so what they did was they took this concept of God creating the world and contracting himself into God exiling himself. They triumphed because they provided an answer to the great problem of the time, to a generation for which the facts of exile and the precariousness of existence in it had become most pressing and cruel. Kabbalism could give an answer unparalleled in breadth and depth and vision. The Kabbalistic answer illuminated the significance of exile and redemption and accounted for the unique historical situation of Israel within the wider, in fact, cosmic context of creation itself. What Gershon Sholem is trying to prove is that they took something that previously had only related to the creation of the world, and they brought it home to the situation of the Jews in exile. And they took this concept of God, in a sense, coming out of his holy abode, or God contracting himself from the world, because there was a little bit of both of them, and they projected that onto the Jewish people. So now, all of a sudden, this idea of being exiled became almost something that could be compared to the divine. I'll finish this little introduction because Gershon Sholem is almost lyrical, and when you read him, he's almost poetic. He says, there is a ruthlessness towards himself, meaning God, for he exiled himself from boundless infinity to a more concentrated infinity. There is a profound inward galut, exile, not the galut of one of the creatures, but of God himself, who limited himself and thereby made place for the universe. So this is where this idea of Tzimzum becomes more than just how does God create a temple or how does God even create a world. And that is what we're going to explore a little bit today. How does that resonate with you, Rabbi?
Well, first of all, I mean, I'm so happy that you started with Gershom Shalom because he's the master of understanding this. And the idea, and that's why it's so great that he called it a continuation. The idea that God, contracting himself becomes God going into exile was such an important pivot by the Jews. And we're still living in that pivot. That's what you said. You said it applies to us even today. We're still living in that pivot. We still see God as going into exile and how that relates to us and how we relate to that. So I love that idea.
And if I'm correct, we have had a previous podcast where you have referenced this concept of Shchinta Begaluta, that the divine presence went with the Jews into exile. That was not something that was created by this concept of Tzimtzum. That already, like many things in the history of ideas, that was existing, but it was, I think, kind of embellished and given more power. The idea of the divine presence also went into exile, or that even when Israel sins, God goes down with them. Those are in the source sheet. We have texts, traditional texts, nothing to do with the Kabbalah, that talk about that. And of course, we find that to be kind of very powerful. And I think in a sense, these are the humanistic aspects, the Hasidic stories about how the simple little Jew or the Jew who might not need knowledgeable in the Torah, God is with that person. I mean, that in itself is a powerful message. But again, we're going to take it into, I think, out of the realm of theology and personal and into the realm of ideology and ideological movements and nationalism and politics. And that, I think, becomes kind of fascinating how that happened.
That is fascinating. Let me just say that idea that God is in exile is based on a very old rabbinic tradition, which is quoting a verse which says, Imo anochi b'tzara, that I am with you in your suffering, and that God actually is with us in our suffering. And that's really amazing, right? So when we go into exile, God goes into exile with us. Imo anochi b'tzara.
Absolutely. And I think you can even make the case that there was in rabbinic tradition a sense of that God would go into the exile. When it says to make me a migdash in Shemot Rabbah, it says, make me a migdash so that I not be on the outside, bachutz. This concept of exile and alienation, being a foreigner, being an alien, whether to oneself or in every aspect, again, it was all there. But the Jews from Safed in their tiny little town on the top of a hill came up with an interpretation that really resounded so strongly that I think will show it really affected so many different currents within Judaism, and that becomes kind of fascinating.
That is great. Good. I'm looking forward to that. Let's look at the sources.
So this thing about the difference between Tzimtzum and emanation, these two are various theories about how the world was created. Shalom says it so beautifully. He said that emanation was progressive stages of gradually coarsening, that is, materializing light. It's a one-way process. And I had always thought that the main revolution in Tzimzum was that it simply reversed that process. But rereading Sholem enlightened me to the fact that even before Luria came along and really revolutionized things, even the first Kabbalists talked about there was two types of light. One was a direct light that emanated, but there was this other reflective light. So what they started to do, even in their early thought process in Safed, is to make this into a two-way street. Now, if you think of creation as a two-way street, that in itself is a powerful idea.
That's a great idea. I love it.
This is what Sholem writes. Luria added paradox to dialectic when he formulated his doctrine of Tzimzum, or retraction or withdrawal. According to this doctrine, the first act of the Creator was not his revelation of himself to something outside, but it was rather the first step was withdrawal or retreat. God withdrew from himself into himself, and by this act, abandoning a region within himself to emptiness, he made room for the worlds to be. The idea here is that God creates this emptiness which permits man to live, which of course is a fascinating idea. The Kabbalists did not explicitly say that the act of Tzimtzum was a divine type and prefiguration of exile. Through the analogy seems obvious, writes Sholem. God, instead of revealing himself, banishes and withdraws himself into the hidden seclusion of his essence. Yet it is surely no accident that the doctrine of Tzimtzum, the first inklings of which appeared among the Kabbalists of Gerona in the 13th century, only really blossomed in after the exile from Spain. And here is where it comes fascinating, because that which should have occupied its appointed and appropriate place had moved somewhere else. That is the situation of exile. However, the situation of not being where one ought to be, namely of being removed from its rightful place, is what is meant by the term exile. In fact, since the breaking of the vessels, that's a Kabbalistic word, exile is the fundamental and exclusive, albeit hidden, mode of all existence. So in other words, exile becomes now not something that we dread and that is out of the ordinary. When God creates the world, in a sense, that creation is creating exile. So the Lurianic historical notion of exile becomes a cosmic symbol. And I'm going to stop with one more. Exile, therefore, had its reason, and this reason was rooted in the nature of creation. There was something startling novel about this Kabbalistic explanation with regard to exile. First and foremost, exile becomes a mission. We all think about creation as something that has purpose, that something was done by God to create all sorts of possibilities. In an amazing turn, the Lurianic Kabbalists turned exile into something that was pregnant with possibility. Talk about turning a bad situation into something, I wouldn't say good, but certainly in terms of something profound and engaging and mission-like.
They had no choice, because since they didn't know how to get out of exile, we don't know how to get out of exile either. So they had no choice, because we're optimists. And if you're an optimist and you're in exile, you need to turn the exile into a positive thing.
So we're going to get down into the weeds a little bit, because it's just great to talk about exile and alienation, and that almost permits us still to remain on the theological level. But what Sholem does, and he does it in two main books. One is the Messianic idea in Judaism. But the one that I will quote from more so is a book on the great false Messiah named Shabtai Tzvi and his disciples, Frank and Nathan of Gaza. We have trouble understanding how profound an effect they had on the Jewish world, and that was part of Sholom's mission to show how far this yearning for this Messiah and the willingness to believe in this guy Shabtai Tzvi, who at the end converted to Islam, his disciple Nathan of Gaza and Frank converted to Christianity, how far they affected so many Jews. And what I'm going to now focus in is some of the elements of the Kabbalah of Tzimzum that really had a large effect. And the first thing that Sholom talks about is how Messianism is, in its origins and by its nature, is a theory of catastrophe. We all use the word end of days. We use the word apocalyptic, and many of us think in terms of Christianity. Sholom says it is one of the strangest errors of the modern Wissenschaft der Juden to deny the continuity of Jewish apocalypse. The endeavors of leading scholars to disassociate apocalyptic from rabbinic Judaism and to associate it exclusively with Christianity has contributed much to the modern falsification of Jewish history and to the concealment of some of its most dynamic forces, both constructive and destructive. Jewish and European Enlightenment subjected the Messianic idea to an ever-advancing secularization of Messianism, came tied up with the idea of eternal progress and infinite task of humanity perfecting itself. What Sholom is saying here is many of us grew up with the idea that ultimately the idea of the Messiah was that that history is forward, is progressive, is forward-leaning, that we are every day moving forward, we're moving to a goal. It's very rational. And we've taken away at great pain, I believe, in Sholom's concept, this concept of the catastrophic aspects of this idea. And what Sholom does, he takes the words right out of this theory of Tzimzum, and I'll focus a second on what happens when God contracts himself. What he leaves behind are certain shards of holiness, certain pieces of light, and those light are covered in klipot, in shells in the material world. Ultimately, something went a little wrong when God retracted himself from the universe. It created this chaos. And what you need, you had Shvirat HaKelim, which is the breaking of the vessels. And as you can imagine, Shvirat, breaking, is a word associated with violence. And then what you need is Tikkun. And this is something that we, beautiful Western American Jews, love to talk about, Tikkun Olam, which is fixing the world, and that we can step by step make the world a better place. But in the strict sense that Sholom wants to bring us back to, Tikkun is actually rectifying something that was made by violence, and he argues that it in of itself can have an element of disruption and catastrophe built into it.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a complicated thing about, what the balance is between catastrophe and opportunity, right? It could be that the same thing that gives the opportunity also can be catastrophic, right? I mean, I think that's an important piece. I mean, you really laid it out very well, but I don't know that being catastrophic and being, and seeing opportunity are necessarily mutually exclusive. They could be two sides of the same coin.
So one of the points that Sholom makes is that there's a very strong element in Messianism that is ahistorical, meaning to say that there is a strong element in it that requires a break with historical development. And that's where he gets into this concept of, from this creation theory of breaking the kalim, of breaking the vessels. And as a result of that, what happened was, according to Sholem, is that there had been many Talmudic and Midrashic texts that talk about the end of days will be a time where the face of the generation is like the face of a dog, or it talks about wisdoms of scholars will be considered putrid, truth will be lacking, youths will humiliate their elders, the entire government will be transformed to heresy, and there will be no rebuke. And many of these ideas were initially talked about in terms as forces almost outside of our control. But with this concept of creation through exile, creation through breaking the vessels and putting them back together, it almost became, it's this wonderful phrase by Tom Friedman, where the Cold War mass mutual destruction was what kept Russia from firing its nuclear warheads on the U.S. and vice versa. And he said, when it comes to Iran, mass mutual destruction is an invitation to the party. What he was referring to is that in some aspects of eschatology and messianism, the breaking of those vessels, the disruption of respect for elders, of the workings of government, is not an outcome of these cataclysmic events. It's actually what brings the events on. And this is how he uses Tzimzum in his introduction to Shabtai Tzvi to explain what ultimately happened with the Shabtai Tzvi and the Franks and the Nathans of Gaza's, was they started actually breaking the laws. They started undermining the rule of the rabbis of their day, of the ethics and the morals. They ended up having incestuous orgies. He makes a straight line between what was in the initial concept of this Tzimzum and breaking the vessels and what happened in that messianic revolution of Shabtai Tzvi.
So I just want to say that Shabtai Tzvi, he made a religion out of breaking the rules. One of the blessings that we make in the morning, we say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech olam, matir asurim, which means that God frees all those who are imprisoned. And Shabtai Tzvi had a play on that. He used to make a bracha every morning, matir isurim, God who allows those things that generally are prohibited. So he actually made a religion out of it, which is bizarre, but I think makes your point really strong.
So I said that I was going to bring it up to the present. I think it's one of the arguments that Sholem makes, and this he's criticized for, is he claims that as a result of Tzimzum and how it evolved, this led to the Haskalah. This led to Jews giving up their religion in order to create the ideal ideal time. Of course, the argument against that is, my God, come on, there was an enlightenment. The enlightenment in the modern world probably affected Jews to have their own minimal enlightenment. So I think there he's a little far-fetched. I think if you make an argument from Heschel and look at American Jewry, where we've now created a generation or two or three that believes in fixing the world, tikkun olam, making the world a better place, is our kind of way of expressing Jewish ethics and messianism. Here too, you see where these concepts that Luria brought into the world profoundly affected a whole generation. It's where, when you get to Israel, and especially the current, you hear many Jews talk about the people who are in power now and trying to take away the powers of the court. They call them messianists. And I think ultimately what the argument is that these people who are now trying to change the fabric of Israel really believe that we are in that moment. I think for them, believe it or not, and I think Bougie, the president, almost intimated that, was not so much the Six-Day War as it was when we pulled out of Gaza. And that's why President Herzog mentioned it. It's kind of like that 30 years after leaving Spain, where they saw that even the state of Israel, even Zionism itself, was not being faithful to its rules and was not going to bring the Messiah. They looked at the IDF, even the Israeli soldiers who were pulling settlers away from settlements. You see this sense of listening to this higher power. There's something fascinating that Shalom says, is that he says the most surprising feature of this system is that except for a highly developed and firmly established tradition of the Messiah, perhaps the Kabbalists would have dispensed with him altogether. What he talks about is that the process becomes more important than even the Messiah himself, that there is so focused on disrupting the tried and the true ways. And there's it's not simply a disregard for the rules that got us here, and by the rules who got us here, I will say religious Zionism, I will say the army, I will say ethics as the Western world has developed it. If you look at some of the writings, it's almost an invitation to the party to say that we are not listening to the ethics that the world is trying to superimpose upon us. We listen to a higher authority. We are not going to simply listen to the existing rules followed by the IDF and by even the traditional rabbis. I think a read of Shalom after looking at the daily newspaper and an understanding of where this all goes is something that becomes very, very fascinating. And what I'd like to do is just finish with a final quote that Shalom wrote that sounds to me like fascinating. He says, "Little wonder that overtones of messianism have accompanied the modern Jewish readiness for irrevocable action in the concrete realm when it is set out on the utopian return to Zion. It is readiness which no longer allows itself to be fed on hopes, born out of the horrors and destruction that was Jewish history in our generation. It is bound to history itself and not to meta-history. It has not given itself up totally to messianism. Whether or not Jewish history will be able to endure this entry into the concrete realm without perishing in the crisis of the messianic claim which has virtually been conjured up, this is the question which out of his great and dangerous past, the Jew of his age poses to his present and to his future." It's just so fascinating that when we play with some of the ideas that brought us here, and we understand that there are parts of it, this apocalyptic, conflict-oriented stuff, it makes us look a little bit different at how messianism can and might be playing itself out. That's what it seems to me anyway.
That's great. I think the fact that you brought it home to, the contemporary world, and obviously messianism is one of those words, one of those concepts that is being debated now, I think really makes it so much more powerful. So the The continuation of Tzimzum, I think, was really fascinating. And I think you took it from through this week's Parsha all the way to the 21st century. And it gives us everybody something to think about. Have a Shabbat Shalom, everybody. And we look forward to seeing you next week as we continue with Parshat Tetzaveh. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Shabbat Shalom, and all the best to everyone.
Enjoy California.
Thank you so much.